Hey Rob,
Luke!
how's it going?
Yeah, we need some kind of human connection. Even if you're a solitary person, you still need some form of connection in order to, just feel like you're part of the human race. Yeah.
All right, do you want to get started on interview questions?
Yeah, hit me. What you got?
All right.
What do you think?
Some of them get wordy, so.
I'm down. I'm a words guy. Let's do it.
So the first one's kind of a basic starting question, but I think it's still important, at least some groundwork. So
Yeah.
You're a year removed from your new country project, Trusty Snakes, coming out, about a year.
Yeah.
You're about 4-ish years from the last Taxpayer's record. So what?
God, is it that long?
It
is that long.
It's 2016, I think, right?
Dear God, you're right.
Could be worse. I could have gone with almost half a decade. Sounds much
Yeah.
better than that. A little bit too much editorializing there, though.
Yeah.
So what inspired you to create another project when you've already got you've got Trusty Snakes and you've got your ongoing Song of the Week program?
Yeah. Well, the reason to create a new project was largely to be able to funnel specific ideas into a larger story. And that's how I like to make records and tell stories is have an overarching theme for something. And with the Taxpayers, all those records all had some kind of a theme behind them, some kind of central idea or some kind of central character or something like that. And the same was the case with the Trusty Snakes record. And, pretty much anything I've ever done has been that way. And the difference with the Song of the Week Club, doing a song every week, is that it did not have that continuity of a larger theme or a larger idea behind it, or even a larger genre or anything like that. And so when really I started working on those kinds of songs after the 2016 election, after the Trump election, and so I was kind of yearning for an outlet to start trying to make sense of the world after that, because some people I talk to about the Trump election, they're like, I saw that coming. A mile away. I did not. There's no fucking way you could have predicted that, in my opinion. It does seem as though people who are more disenfranchised than myself, some of them are more likely to say, I could have imagined that from America, that we would have elected that guy, that could happen. But it blindsided me, and so I did not really understand how it was that reality shifted so quickly, or I guess I didn't understand how I myself did not understand the rest of America like I thought I did. Like, I was under no illusions that there was a large portion of the country that had different political beliefs than me. I've always known that, but I didn't know that we were so out of touch that 40% of the country would end up supporting a person who's clearly a con man,
Yeah.
like a narcissistic con man.
Yeah.
And so that's when I started working on songs about that, which was even before I think I started the Song of the Week Club. And so, a few years went by, 4 years, I guess, went by, and I realized that I had just a ton of songs that fell into this one idea, and the idea was international topics related to reality shifting events, like events that changed reality in some way for either one group of people, one region of the world, or the world at large. And so I tried to kind of weed through all those songs and then kind of create an umbrella project for it. And so yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that answers my question and gets into other questions I have. So that was awesome.
Yeah. Obviously I could talk a lot about it, but that's the general gist of it, is that it's a place to put songs about a specific, topic, and it's a topic that while I think the Taxpayers have done some of that before, and some of the other projects have done some of that, I've never had anything that was explicitly for. I mean, really, a lot of the Anxiety Cat songs are like overtly political songs.
Right.
They're very overtly political, and I've done stuff like that before, but I've never done an entire album that was strictly about that. And I've also never done anything that was digital, and a lot of the Anxiety Cat stuff is also digital, and so I wanted to try to explore digital electronic music a little bit more, because I think it gets a bad rap. Especially in the DIY world, electronic music gets a really bad rap. And, there's plenty of garbage out there, just like there's plenty of garbage in every genre. But I had come across a few things that I was like, wow, I feel like all of my ideas about electronic music were wrong growing up. And so I wanted to try to make something that utilized that genre of music while also incorporating acoustic elements into electronic. And so, I don't know, it's just kind of an excuse to play around with, like, number one, the international themes of reality shifting events, and then number two, utilize electronic music and, like, audio excerpts in a way that could be pop songs also. Because I've heard audio excerpts being used for songs. In a lot of cases, it's for like noise music or for art pieces and things like that. And, I dig that stuff, but you don't hear a lot of just straight up songs being made out of them. And so I was like, I wonder if I can make some songs out of some of these audio excerpts. And so I tried to find different audio excerpts that were that I could build the songs around. And it's been just an experiment. It's like anything. It's an experiment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have a question that kind of branches off of what you're discussing about all of your projects having being born out of a general overarching theme.
Yeah.
And that's that a very good number of projects you've been involved with have been sort of multi-pronged or using multiple mediums, whether it be the best known one probably being the novella that goes along with God Forgive These Bastards. But there's the zine that goes along with To Risk So Much for One Damn Meal, and the, albeit unreleased, comic that was gonna go with Cold Hearted Town.
Yeah, you're good. You know this stuff. Nobody knows about that one.
Well, that's because it's logged in my head as something that exists somewhere. Gee, it'd be fun to see.
Yeah, so. No, it's I have a bunch of mock-ups on 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper of that comic book, and it was it's a shame that it never happened, but it just I couldn't make it work.
So to the question part of one of my long rambling things, so including what I've included into, is there supposed to be a visual component for Anxiety Cat, like music videos to go with it?
Yeah.
So do you find an inherent value for yourself or just in general in presenting art through a collaboration of mediums? Like, do you think there's something specific added to be gained through that process?
I do. I should first say there's no right way to make art of any kind.
Of course.
Obviously, but for me, I think the multimedia thing comes from. So I'm a teacher,
right.
And one of the things that you learn, and by the way, what I'm about to say has actually been debunked in some ways, but in the 1970s, there was a bunch of research studies that were going out about learning styles, and the primary learning styles being visual, auditory, kinesthetic, meaning like you manipulate things with your hands and you learn best by just working things out with your hands. People like carpenters and artists are often kinesthetic learners, and so on and so forth, right? So there's like these larger learning styles, and the idea behind this in education is that if you can tap into different people's learning styles, you can reach everyone. But the problem with education is that oftentimes we only teach with one method, right? You usually in college, at least, a lot of times it is the professor who's just giving a lecture, right? Yeah. So that would only appeal to the auditory learners. Or if you're only showing, documentaries and movies in this classroom, you're only going to be appealing to the visual learners. And so the reason you learn about this in teaching school when you're trying to learn how to be the best teacher you can is that they say, every single lesson that you do should try to incorporate different learning styles. Now, like I said at the beginning, some of this has been debunked in terms of like a cognitive level. Like some researchers are saying, well, it's not quite so simple. It's a little more complex than just saying like, well, you're a visual learner, you're an auditory learner. But the point stands that the best way to learn or to consume something is to present it or consume it through a variety of sources, because then you're engaging different parts of your brain and you're going to be able to reach people that maybe you wouldn't otherwise reach. And so I don't always think about this every time I'm making something, but it's kind of in the back of my head, the idea that sometimes you can create a richer story by presenting it through a variety of sources. And like for me, I'm very much a lyrics guy. I really concentrate on words and lyrics, and I've come to the unfortunate conclusion that not a lot of people listen to music that way, which is fine. Most people don't have a lyric sheet in front of them and think about what different couplets mean and how this word rhymes with a word in the previous paragraph, and it's ties in this way, and most people are hearing things and they're listening to the music on a for the pleasure center of their brain, and that's totally fine. But if you're trying to tell a story that is lyric based and trying to present that story to folks who are not lyric people, then sometimes you got to try different methods. And so that's why not to mention, it's just fun to try to tell stories in different ways. Like it's like how do I tell that story?
Right.
Wonder if I can write a comic book. And it turns out I can't write a comic book, so the answer is no to that one.
But you tried it. You flexed that muscle.
But I tried it. Yeah, I tried. Yeah.
I actually have a very, very on topic anecdote about the whole different learning methods thing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this older woman that I grew up volunteering with at my local arts center. I've known her for many years, and she once was telling me about the main man behind those concepts. He was a lecturer at Harvard.
Right.
And she had him as a professor. And
oh, yeah?
The ultimate irony was he taught his classes as just straightforward lecture, with the reasoning that it was Harvard tradition.
Jeez, that's ridiculous.
I know. It's just something that always stuck in my head as being
that's really funny. And in some of that, I feel like is part of the reason that it's been debunked, or that there's been some criticism of it, is that like every education book includes this what they call the learning styles inventory, and the learning styles inventory is like a checklist where you go through it and you're like, I wonder what kind of learning style I have, and then it's like, do you learn best when watching movies? And if you circle this answer, then it's a few points in that direction, and blah blah blah. And a lot of more contemporary researchers in education have been like, that's such a deductionist way of looking at education. Like nobody's just a visual learner, right. And nobody's just a one thing. So yeah, it's but not to knock it though, because it is important to maybe think about how do you reach different types of students, because I mean, anybody who's been through high school or junior high knows that there's tons of people, myself included, who most of the lessons did not reach me because they weren't, either the teacher didn't give a shit about reaching me, or, they had gotten so into the habit of just utilizing worksheets and, pop quizzes and that kind of stuff that they just kind of they gave up after a while. So it's important to explore. But you're right. Yeah, I mean, plenty of examples of hypocrisy in the educational world. I'm sure it does not surprise me to hear that one of the inventors of the learning styles inventory was a lecturer primarily.
So a quick follow up to that. I kind of have a general idea of your answer, but just to be clear, so would you consider a project like Anxiety Cat or one of your prior projects that have been multimedia, multi-formatted, do you consider the audio components to work as standalone pieces, or do you think there's something inherent missing or to be gained from those aspects?
I mean, it depends on the project, depends on the song. Like the Henry Turner record and book, I feel like you're missing out a lot if you don't have the book.
You're getting a lot of context with that.
Yeah, like there's plenty of stuff that's just not in the songs, but where there's a little tiny reference in the songs that you can only really understand by reading this one chapter of the book.
You're not going to get a bastard in a business suit just tried to rob me, you know what, I think he might have been the fucking devil. You're not going to get that without the book.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, and so the most popular song off of that record is the I Love You Like an Alcoholic song.
Which sounds so different than most of the record.
Yeah, and it's not a love song by any means. I mean, in some ways it's a love song, but, you know, I feel like 99% of the people who see that on YouTube, they're like, oh, this is a French-sounding folk band is what this must be. And, you know, it's part of a larger story about this broken person. And so, you know, yeah, I do feel like you miss out a lot on that. Now, other cases, you know, not so much. I do think in some ways the Cold-Hearted Town one, there were some things that were explored in those songs that were intended to be a part of this comic book that now they just live in the ether. And so, you know, the only person who has any idea what that song's all about is my dumb brain that didn't really figure out a way to make it work. But you know, as far as Anxiety Cat goes, yes, and I feel bad that I have not forwarded you any of the videos that I've worked on some of those. Like, for example, the second song on the record is called The End of Growth, and it uses a excerpt of one of the last speeches by Muammar Gaddafi, which is in Arabic. And if you just hear the song on its own, you're like, what is this about? What is this? First off, if I don't speak Arabic, what is he saying? And second, even if I do speak Arabic, what is the reason for these words to be included in this song? And so there's a lot of context that's missing without the video, because the video that I put together for that, and most of the videos that I put together for the Anxiety Cat thing, have been collage pieces, which the songs themselves are kind of collage songs in a way.
The structure of the album seems very collagey.
Yeah. It's very much
maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's very collage based, and the video for that song is also. But the video has that the video itself and the audio. It's got subtitles to go along with it. And when coupled with all of the images that it goes along with, I think his speech makes a little bit more sense, not just in terms of the song, but also in context of the album, because the video is kind of showing the first off, the decline of stability in nations around the world, but also so what he's saying in this speech is he's basically saying, okay, I'm Muammar Gaddafi, and millions of people defend me. And he was giving this, it was a very desperate speech when he had been warning for decades that they were coming to get him, and he's a very paranoid guy, but then he's saying, like, millions of people defend me, and we are going to purify Libya inch by inch, and we will go from one end of the desert to the other, and we will purify it. And not long after he said millions of people defend him, he was killed, and he was brutally killed. And I don't know how much you know about the overthrow of Gaddafi, but it's a fascinating story. And I learned a lot about it just in the process of writing this song. In fact, I probably spent the most time researching that specific topic in creating this album, because that entire thing I feel like is an encapsulation of everything that is happening in the world right now. And him as a leader is an encapsulation of all of the authoritarian leaders that we have right now. And he was overthrown in 2011, and it was almost like it marked the beginning of a new era of instability. And definitely the instability began before that, and it will continue long after that. But it was like a kind of a way for me to think about the structural instability of certain countries and why it is that certain leaders are able to exert influence. And so, I can talk about this for a while. You can interrupt anytime if I'm talking too long about this. But so basically, Gaddafi, right? I have always considered myself to be someone that I read a lot of the news, and I try to stay updated on the news, and I try to consume the types of news that I've always thought were non-biased sources. And these are things like, Democracy Now! And NPR and all that, right? Mm-hmm. And I realized in the process of researching more about Gaddafi that those sources are not quite as unbiased as I had led myself to believe. And I had an idea about who Gaddafi was that by the end of this anxiety project, I have a completely different idea about who he was and who he is to the people of North Africa and in the region that he was a part of. So I was led to believe this guy was a fucking monster and everybody hated him. And he was a dictator, and he was a totalitarian dictator who had seized power in 1969, and he had stayed in power until the moment he was overthrown in 2011. So he was in power from 1969 to 2011. And he wasn't president during all that time. He's kind of like Putin, where he would just shift around what his title was. Like, he's like, I'm president, I'm prime minister, I'm, the colonel of the army, but he's the leader. Just like Putin is really the leader of Russia. It doesn't matter who's officially in charge. Putin's in charge. And the same was true about Gaddafi. But I learned more about it, and here's what kind of woke me up to it. I'm learning about Gaddafi and how it was that he took power in Libya, and I'm reading these message boards, and I'm asking questions of Libyans in these message boards, and asking questions of people who, lived under his rule and are there now. And what I kept realizing, and I was like, this can't all be bots that are saying this. This can't all be propaganda bots that are just telling me what the propaganda wants me to hear, but all of them fucking love this guy and were so upset that he was overthrown. And I started looking at every corner of the internet, and there is not very much Gaddafi hate on the internet outside of the Western media. And going into it, I'm like, okay, this guy's a fucking monster. He just was just brutal to his people, which is also true, by the way. He's not a good guy, in my opinion. Like, I haven't come to the conclusion that he's a good guy, but he's a more complex figure than I realized going into it. And he has more good qualities than I realized going into it. And so I started asking all these questions, and I started researching more about it. And let me tell you just like a couple of the big points that I learned about Gaddafi in the process of writing that song and working on this record. So the first thing is, like, Luke, do you know how he took power in Libya? Have you heard about this at all?
I do not. I don't know much about North Africa.
Yeah, so before Gaddafi in the 1960s and been prior to 1969 when he took over, they had a monarchy and they had a king. And the people in Libya generally were not very pleased with how things were run under the monarchy. So Gaddafi, as a young man, he's like 18 years old, he joins the military, and him and his friends, they go to another country to get trained to be in the military, the Libyan military, and they come back and he starts saying, like, we can change things. And he starts convincing some of his fellow other people in the army that, like, we need to overthrow this king. And we need to make a democracy in Libya for the first time ever. He's like, we need to create a democracy that is a better democracy than the United States, because the United States is not an example of a democracy anymore. And, like, all of his criticisms of the United States from that time are just spot on. It's basically like their electoral system is a fraud that is, pretending to be a democracy. And he's like, my enemy is not the American people. My enemy is everyone deserves democracy. Yeah. So he comes back to Libya, and get this, they overthrow the king in a coup that is completely bloodless. Wow. They don't kill anyone. Nobody dies during this coup. And they basically tell the king, like, you can leave. We won't kill you if you get the fuck out now. And he did. And he, like, left. He went to Europe. And so Gaddafi takes over, and he's like, I'm not in charge, but I will help this is the story of how all dictators start, by the way. I'm not in charge, officially, but
the military man that comes in times of unease and transition, and then
we're never going to be in transition for a while, But so that's exactly what happens. But the crazy thing is that he like succeeds in a lot of the shit that he says he's going to do. So like he creates what is it called? He has a term for it that is escaping me right now, but basically what it is it's a form of direct democracy where each people in each region have a like duly elected person in these small little regions of like less than 100 people who have the power to make decisions for their small little region. It's kind of like it's similar to what we're supposed to have in the United States with representative government, but in fact it's just become this weird republic, this constitutional republic that we have. And so they do that, and he says, okay, we have all this oil. How can we use this to benefit our country? And he begins stabilizing Libya by, just selling all their fucking oil all around the world. And what he uses that money for is they create some of the best infrastructure in North Africa at the time. Still to this day, still has some of the best infrastructure in terms of like its road, its water systems, its sewage. And he says anybody in Libya who wants to get a college education, the Libyan government will pay for it, even if you go overseas to another country. So Libyans could go to, for example, Oxford in England, or they could go to Harvard in the United States, and the Libyan government would pay for their college education. And they did this, and they did it with all their oil money. They basically educated their citizens. And a lot of them came back home, and they had this huge high percentage of doctors and very educated people. And so, people loved this guy as a result. Here they were like, actually, people are getting educated. The country's changing. It's more stable. And, and then eventually the years drag on and he refuses to give up power, just like the age-old story. And, and so he changes it a few times, and, he says, okay, I'm not in charge, but really he's the one that's in charge, and he kind of becomes more and more paranoid as time goes on. He creates some gulags almost, and he kind of just becomes more and more power hungry, more and more crazy as time goes on. But even the people that I've talked to about this on the internet, at least, which, to be clear, I don't know exactly who I'm talking about because the internet's anonymous. I don't know if I'm talking to a pro-Gaddafi propagandist or anything like that. But assuming that they were being genuine in what they were saying, people, even after the 2011 overthrow of Gaddafi, still loved the guy despite all his flaws, because they were like, before him, we didn't have what we have now. And we are like, before the overthrow of Gaddafi, we were just such a shining star in North Africa and in like the Middle East and just that whole region. We were just such a shining star for what could be. And that's why they loved this guy, and they were so upset that he got overthrown. So he gets overthrown by these random – nobody knows exactly who these rebels were that overthrew him. And I didn't know this. While I'm listening to NPR talk about the overthrow of Gaddafi in 2011, it's being made clear to me that Gaddafi he's a monster, he's a dictator, everybody wants him gone. The rebels are local Libyans who want change, which could be true, could be not true. But what I've read more and more is that nobody is entirely clear who was in charge of these rebels outside of the fact that a lot of them had training in the United States. And
the one thing I'll say about that is one of my favorite courses I took in the final year of my undergrad was an overlap course discussing the interactions between the Cold War and Africa. And there's just so many cases of Africa being used as a pawn, CIA agents being suspiciously around key assassinations of rulers that would have stabilized different, Central African or Sub-Saharan African countries and stuff. So that's something that's, whenever I'm hearing about, king making and, coup throwing in African regions like that, that's something that's always in the back of my mind, that there always seems to be outward forces that are sort of toying with the continent.
Yeah, and that seems to be what happened in 2011, like to a degree at least. and yeah, there's plenty of examples of the CIA interfering in Central America, South America. In the 1960s. That was just happening everywhere down there. And so, yeah, like it's almost like, had I been manipulated to think a certain way about this region that I know nothing about? I knew nothing about Gaddafi. All I knew was what I heard on NPR about it, and what I read in the New York Times about it, and these sources that I was under the impression were unbiased. And I'm not trying to say that the New York Times and NPR are unbiased. I don't think they are. I think they just report on what's happening, and as a result, a lot of what's happening is being manipulated intentionally so that when it ends up in the news, it sounds a certain way, And so, I don't know. Basically, that was kind of the reason that Anxiety Cat record took off, was I was like, oh, wow, I've been manipulated. My thoughts about this guy have been manipulated. I wonder what else is out there that I was wrong about. And so the video for that song, it shows like Gaddafi as a raving maniac at the end of his life, but then it also shows a couple of things towards the end of the video of him just playing with his granddaughter in a tent. Like, to the very bitter end, he lived in a tent in the desert. He was not an opulent guy. Well, in some ways he was an opulent guy. He had like gold guns and stuff like that. But, but he also, he was a Bedouin trader is what he came from. And, there's just video of him hanging out with his granddaughter right around the same time that he gave this like horrifying speech about purifying Libya inch by inch. And, there he is just being a grandpa, just being a sweet grandpa, laughing with his granddaughter. And it's like, yeah. Yeah, so felt like that was kind of the perfect encapsulation of what all that was, is this Gaddafi situation.
Oh, I really like that. I like I have a big issue with people that take the concept of evil to turn humans into monsters to comfort themselves, as in, the person who committed the individual who committed this crime was not a human, they're a monster. It others them and helps people sleep at night, because surely not someone like myself is not capable of that, because I'm a person. So I like this. It kind of humanizes him in a troublesome way for a lot of people, where you keep the humanity, and now you have to grapple with the deeds and also the personal behavior. The capacity for both.
That's the crazy thing about it, is like, I'm still unclear on how to feel about this guy. Mm-hmm. Like, there's plenty of stuff that he was a fucking monster, but then it's more complex than I realized. And it's like, and you're right. I think that we tell ourselves that people are evil because it makes it easier to write them off, and it also makes violence against them easier. Sure. It's like, when a government is getting ready to kill off someone, they just dehumanize them. They make them seem less than. The same thing happened in the Middle East around the time of the Iraq War. Saddam Hussein, kind of a similar figure. Mm-hmm. Plenty of examples of him being a monster. He had like an SS, basically. He had a secret police force, and they did crazy shit. But he was also, he wasn't only evil. He was a complex guy. But how he was sold to us, at least in Western media, is, here is a man with weapons of destruction who is going to gas his own people, which, becomes easier to kill a guy if he's an evil monster.
Exactly, because you have to somewhat, to some degree, you have to keep favor with the populace. If literally everyone is upset, then eventually a majority of, Congress is upset, and you're really hogtied on how full in you can go on certain efforts. So,
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, and then that begs the question, well, what do you do about it? And I don't know the answer to that, other than just be aware of it, right? Yeah. Just like...
And I think that's sort of the part of one of the cruxes of this project, it seems like, isn't about having answers. It's more just showing how deep everything goes, and to, start from a place of understanding and work your way out. You're probably not going to come to the end of everything, but you're going to you're going to keep plugging away.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, shit, man. Like, and anyway, we're all wondering, what can we do about these forces in the world? And it does feel like we're in an era in which individual action feels impossible. Like it feels like nothing can come of individual action. Things like, protesting and strikes and things like that. They just it seems like it is so ineffective in 2020. That's like, what do you do? And I don't have the answer to that. Wish I knew. Yeah.
All right, let's move on to another question, huh?
Cool.
So this one is, I'm going to ask you about a specific track because it's the one that I think I liked the most, which was Balloons. Okay. But the reason I think I like it the most was because I think I got a lot of the message intended in it, though once again I could be entirely wrong. So I'd like to hear sort of your intentions with this song, and specifically the intended meaning behind what seems to be a recurring symbol of a balloon. Because I know you brought up balloons in The End of Growth, too.
Yeah. So you're talking about the song Balloons?
Yes.
Yeah. You just want me to just talk about that? Or you have a specific question about it, or just what did the balloons?
What's the intent, the narrative of it? Because I have ideas of what I think it is, but I'd love to hear what the intention behind it is, to see if I'm on track or if I'm way off base or something.
Yeah. So the balloons are kind of you're right. They were kind of a recurring theme for this like research of all this project, and so each song actually kind of has its own balloons within it. They're not always called balloons, but for me, it's the peanuts that you give a populace that is like placation peanuts, you might call them. It's like it's the stimulus check that everybody just got in the mail. Those are balloons, and like it's like every government that's trying to exert some kind of influence. Not even every government, any person or group or whatever that wants to exert influence over a large group of people, how do you garner trust and how do you garner support? And the way you do that is you kind of dangle these balloons over them, and you're like, hey, you know what? Before me, you didn't have, you didn't have this oil money and the opportunity for college education in Libya, right? Those are the balloons. Right. In the United States. Hey, if Trump just gave us a $1,200 stimulus check. I've been hearing this crazy argument, by the way, of plenty of people saying, like, thank God Trump's in charge because he's a rich businessman. He was able to give us all $1,200 checks. If Obama was in charge, he couldn't have done that. And it's like, you fucking think this is coming out of his bank account?
So many people just fundamentally don't understand. It's their money.
Yeah, exactly. And so, so those are the peanuts. Those are the balloons right there. Okay. And
we're on the same page with that then.
Yeah, and like North Korea has their examples of their balloons, and just every country kind of has some version of it. It's just a way of keeping the populace happy and content and unquestioning.
North Korea is kind of the country I had in mind when I was listening to this.
Yeah. That was when I was writing it. That's one of the countries I had in mind, definitely.
Because I have, I think I wrote the most notes on this song. Like I said, I felt like I got the most out of it. So I wrote a note about, it's from the perspective of the truly convinced or the truly converted.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of, which I thought was, There are a lot of things in this track that I thought you built upon really well to like fortify the message. You start with the toddler singing "We Thank You God," which gives you that the childlike innocence and the belief of what's happening.
Isn't that a beautiful audio excerpt, by the way? That's from the 80s. It
just sounds like a home video.
It is, yeah. It's like, so it's this mother who's just teaching. She's got a guitar and she's teaching her toddler some gospel songs, and the toddler clearly like knows some of these songs already, and just 3 years old maybe, and has already been and to be clear, I guess I should say that I'm not necessarily hating on this mother or this toddler. They seem great. Honestly, I think it's just a beautiful audio excerpt of kind of just a sweet moment between a mother and a daughter. But yeah, you're right. The reason that I included it is because, this you might be able to argue that this toddler's being indoctrinated with something right there.
Yeah.
And
I wasn't even going that far with it. Just sort of the idea of the same message that was coming up later in the song, but
yeah,
it was another good fortifying example in my mind of that of the conviction of belief. So just the idea
that's a good way of putting it. Yeah,
just the general idea of anything you tell a 3-year-old is going to be taken at face value.
sure.
Not as like a good or bad thing, just as a thing.
That's what it is. Yeah. When you're, and it's not until there is a certain period in the brain development in which we can begin questioning what we're told, but it's not until, I mean, 7, maybe 8 years old that we can begin questioning on like any realistic level, and beyond that, from a more complex level, many adults still haven't even managed to grasp that. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, you're spot on. It's I think that's a good way of putting it. The conviction of belief and the ability to convince yourself that despite all of the shitstorm that is around you and maybe how horrible things are, you're like, hey, I got this, and other places don't have this. And, we're doing pretty good. And we do a damn good job of convincing ourselves of that in America, don't we? In the United States. Plenty of people you hear right now, and we've been hearing this for a while, of they interview someone, why did you decide to come to Costco without a mask, and why do you refuse to wear your mask? And they're like, it's because this is a free country, and last I remember we were in America, and this is an individualist country. If you take away our individualism, what do we have left? And individualism is a dream that's been sold to the American people.
Yes, the
and
individualist, yes.
It's the idea that, well, hey, sure, you need 3 jobs in order to make rent, and you're impoverished, and you can't afford to buy your own home, and you're in massive debt, but you're free.
Sure.
Yeah. So, yeah, those we all got those balloons in some way. I feel like. Yeah, I like that one too. I had a lot of fun playing around with that one.
Just really catchy.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was one of the first ones that I really started fucking around with the electronic stuff.
I really like the devolution of the hook at the end, which sort of gives you that like hive sound to it, where it's just it very much homogenizes, and it's all like we're on the same page.
You're an astute listener, Luke. I don't expect most people to pick up on that kind of stuff, but that was like the idea of this crescendo of belief, this crescendo of conviction that eventually just falls apart. And then it starts up again. And it starts up again. The metronome starts up again, and it never ends.
You're right about you're right about the falling apart thing. That was the part of the dichotomy of why I liked it, was because it showed that everything was on the same page, but it also showed like a sonic devolution. Like it's showing like everyone is convinced of one thing, but this is actually what's happening.
Yeah, and kind of that ending right there, where it just falls apart. There's a shattering of glass. Right, that moment happens everywhere. Like that moment is the moment in Libya was in 2011 when Gaddafi got overthrown. That was the shattering of the thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so they're kind of in this state of chaos still, where they have not picked up the pieces. And who knows how long it'll be before they do pick up the pieces. But they eventually will. And that's not to say it'll be good what ends up. Hopefully it is. But eventually, the cycle just repeats. It just repeats and repeats and repeats. And hopefully we get a little bit better at it with each passing of the cycle. Hopefully people get more rights and people get more understanding of how these processes work, and people get more educated and so on and so forth. But there's no guarantee of it. You got to fight for those things, and people really have to want that, and there has to be a concerted effort. And people also have to believe to some degree, not in individualism, but in collectivism, in order to be able to achieve a successful restructuring after it all falls apart. We're kind of at the pinnacle of that in terms of like where, if you could point on a map where we're at in terms of the balloon song in the United States, I'd say we're pretty much right at the end. It hasn't fallen apart yet, but it's just starting to waver and it's gotten pretty chaotic. And we're pretty much right on the precipice of the falling apart. And I do not hope for that. And I never hope for that. And I never want to see any place become so destabilized that, the people who are the most at risk, the most impoverished, the most, the children and everything, you never want to see that happen. I never want to root that on, but it's also, in some ways, I guess it is a chance to try to rebuild anew, but like, what chance do you have to rebuild anew if you have a population that's been so indoctrinated and so manipulated? And it's like, where do you even start? I don't know. And the only answer I've ever been able to come up with any of that, and these are questions that I've asked myself as long as I've been old enough to ask them, and the only solution I have to that is education. And so, when I decided to become a teacher, I was like, I don't think I'm not going to solve the problems of the world by being a teacher, but I don't know. It seems like that's the one thing that you can do is if you can give people an education, then they can become a bit more self-sufficient. And, I don't know what you do beyond that is, you try to give people the means to learn things themselves and pick themselves up. And I don't know.
Yeah. It's an important starting block.
I guess it's a place to start, if nothing else. Yeah.
My next question is a technical question, or maybe stylistic. I don't know. Words are tough sometimes. So there seems to be this very marked dichotomy in your vocal delivery on this project. I noticed. Like there are some songs like Balloons and others where it's very melodic, very easily set out. But then you have other ones such as Dolls, which devolve so quickly, or pretty much all the vocals in a song like The Frenzy, they're very manic and oftentimes go beyond comprehension without a lyric sheet in front of you, which I didn't have.
Yeah, I should have sent you that, huh?
No, it's more fun this way.
Yeah.
So, is there a correspondence between the vocal deliveries and the topic manners, or maybe like the perspectives you were trying to inhabit and portray on those tracks?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, for sure with The Frenzy. I mean, when you're trying to inhabit the mind of how do I put this? How do you inhabit the mind of a Trump supporter, or not just Trump, but just really any rabid believer in a cause? And by the way, that can be an anarchist, that can be just anyone who's a rabid believer in something. How do you inhabit that without being a little bit frantic? And so, yeah, definitely. When I was fucking around with the vocal delivery method for that, the first idea that I had for how to convey that with Dolls Inside of Dolls is I was like, I wonder how it would sound to whisper, talk, and scream the same line over top each other at the same time. Oh. And that's would that adequately convey this kind of fervor? And I think whispering coupled with screaming, or whispering coupled with anything, is really scary. And I heard Ian MacKay. I've never known how to pronounce his last name.
MacKay. I'm not sure though.
Yeah. But Ian MacKay of the band Minor Threat and the Evens. Well, when the Evens first came out, he said, they're like, "Why aren't you screaming in the Evens?" And he said, "Well, if you want people to really listen, you can convey so much more anger with a whisper than you can with screaming. Because if you're screaming in people's face, they step back and they stop listening to you. But if you whisper something, they lean in to hear. They want to hear you, and you can convey a lot more that way." And I always took that. I made a mental note when I read that. It was an interview he did once, and And so, yeah, I think like whispering can be a really scary thing to hear. So I did that for the, not for the Frenzy, but for Dolls Inside of Dolls, at least the chorus part. And it really freaked me out. I played it for Elise, my partner, and she was like, "What the fuck? That's terrifying. Don't do that. Stop doing that." And so, like it's definitely, yeah. And I'm kind of new to manipulating all this in a DAW is what they call the programs you use to mix and master and record things. I use Logic, and the reason I use Logic is I bought a MacBook Pro, an old MacBook Pro about 6 years ago, and it just had it pre-installed on it from the guy. I bought it off Craigslist, and it already had Logic installed, which is kind of a more sophisticated version of GarageBand. It's not a ton more complex. And, I never knew how to do any of this for most of the time with the Taxpayers. But then for the last record of the Taxpayers, Trevor, who recorded a lot of our albums, he kind of showed me how to use Logic. And then I started really messing around with it a few years ago and trying to figure out how to take some of these vocals and, present it in a different way, because the only way I knew how to write songs before and record songs was, you get a guitar, you get a piano or whatever you want to play with, and you shout or you sing or you do whatever. But there's so much more you can do when you are able to harness the recording software, when you know how to use it,
Yeah.
And so it's been years and trying to figure out how all this stuff works. It's like learning a language. But once you can speak the language, you have so much more power with what you can do. So yeah. To answer your question, yeah, I was shooting for that. And it's hard to convey, but yeah, it becomes easier once you can figure out how to manipulate things in the recording software a little bit, which has been a fun part of the Anxiety Cat thing, is trying to figure out how to manipulate things to convey certain ideas sonically. But yeah.
Can I also just make a note that I think you might be the first person I've ever met that refers to Ian MacKaye as the singer from Minor Threat and The Evens.
Yeah, I think The Evens is a superior band to Minor Threat. Now, Fugazi, of course, is, iconic. Like, when we started the Taxpayers, me and Noah was one of the first people that I reached out to about starting the band. And, Fugazi was definitely one of the groups that we were like, what are we shooting for? What do we like? We like Fugazi. We like the Minutemen,
Yeah, especially
and so I love
ethos standpoint.
Yeah, but the Evens are even in some ways a lot more interesting just because of how different it is from his prior work. Like, Fugazi still had elements of Minor Threat.
Right. No, you're very right on that.
Yeah, which I love. I love both those bands, but yeah,
it's hard to go wrong on Discord.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, they're always killing it.
It's just
yeah. I don't know how he does it.
It's just a labor of love with that guy. He also archives.
Oh really?
Yeah, like a lot of it he's given to the Washington D.C. library as like the D.C. Punk Archive, but he also archives specifically all the history of Discord and everything.
That's amazing. I would love to read some of that stuff. I wonder if you can just walk into the DC library and poke around in there. I'd love to do that someday.
Yeah, that's very much up my alley as well.
Yeah, man, that's cool.
I love thinking of just bands from this community in 40 years. People are like, what? That stuff is somewhere where I can access it and like go through it. Like that. Always the type
well, it's such a service that you're doing for that reason. It's like, most of the people and the bands that make this stuff, they don't, like, I certainly never really thought long term, like, okay, I made this CDR and what's going to come of it in 10 years? You're just kind of doing it day by day.
Right.
And all that stuff gets lost to the ether without somebody to keep track of it. And so it's like, Luke, have you ever read the comic book Sandman before?
No, that's Gaiman though, right? Did he write it?
Yeah, it's it's one of my favorite stories ever told. I think it's one of the greatest stories ever told. It's so complex, and it's just so, you got to read it from the start, go all the way to the end. But there's a character in it who's called Lucien,
Okay.
and you kind of are serving that role of Lucien. And what Lucien is so Sandman is the story of this entity called Morpheus, or the Sandman. He's basically the entity that creates dreams and stories and all of this. And he has this ethereal world that he has created and that he resides in, that he's kind of the king of. And he has different entities that take care of the place. There's kind of a groundskeeper Willie character that's called Merv Pumpkinhead. He's just a pumpkin head. He's just got a guy with, always smoking a cigar. But then the librarian's name is Lucien. And Lucien is the keeper of the library of stories that were never completed. Wow. So like things that were basically stories that were like an author dreamed up, that had the idea for. Maybe they started, maybe they didn't, but they never finished it and nobody ever saw it. And so it exists in Lucien's library in this, place. And the reason that Lucien collects them is, for posterity, just to say like this existed and this is there, and somebody's got to keep track of it, and somebody's got to remember that this happened, or otherwise it didn't happen. And so, you kind of serve that role within this world, and I am grateful for one.
well, thank you, Rob.
Yeah.
Man, just the idea of that library sounds awesome.
Oh, it's beautiful. I mean, there's so many aspects of the story that it's going to just rock your socks off, buddy. You got to read it. You can get it from the library. You can reserve any number of them. But, yeah, just pick it up from the start and go through it. If you're into mythology and fiction, nonfiction, historical, like he incorporates everything from Shakespeare to punk rock to just like anything you can imagine is in there.
Absolutely dig up a copy.
Yeah, and it's a massive saga. He started it in the early '80s, and the final edition of the official story was 5 years ago, maybe. So there's a ton of stuff. There's a ton of books, but all of it ties together, and that's the beautiful thing, is that it all works together. This thing that lasted for 30 years, just all. And by the last thing, you're just floored. You're like, how the fuck did he do this? How was this done?
How did he weave that all together?
Yeah, who could do that? It's remarkable. But yeah, that is my recommendation to you, my friend.
Absolutely, I'll take it to heart. Now, I have a very straightforward question, I think.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, it's a symbol that I'm not sure about. Who are the roosters? What are the roosters?
Oh, cool. Yeah, that's a great question.
I have the vaguest idea, but please tell me.
Yeah, for me, and I should preface this by saying I don't think there's a wrong way to take anything. People can have different opinions on this. My idea, and by the way, sometimes symbols take on new meaning after they're created. Like for myself, sometimes I'll make something with an idea in mind, and then I'll realize a year later that maybe there was more to it than I originally realized. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes your subconscious is creating things that you don't consciously even realize at the moment. And so, but anyway, that's a dumb preface. But all right, here's my explanation for the roosters. So the roosters are anything that is immobile, like something that does not move, like a person or a type of person or a type of thing in the world that is so confident and averse to change that eventually the world has to force it to change. And I thought that roosters were a good symbol for this, because roosters they're so cocksure, they're so confident, they're kind of dicks. If you've ever encountered a rooster, they're pretty rough around the edges. They'll go after a toddler and they'll just peck him to death. Like Elise has a story about this rooster that used to just chase her around the neighborhood as a kid and just terrorize her. So these are but they serve a purpose in some ways. Obviously, like I have chickens and we don't have a rooster, and so the hawks pick them off one by one occasionally. Sometimes the raccoons get them because we don't have a rooster. So, but the reason for them in the context of the story, and by the way, I was going to call this album Roosters because I feel like it's such an important symbol within this world of the Anxiety Cat songs. I was pretty darn close to calling it Roosters because I think that another example of roosters would be some of these dictators that are discussed in the story. Like, for example, Trump is very much a rooster, and Gaddafi, Putin. These are the manly. They take charge. They're in charge, despite all evidence to the contrary. They have to be in charge, but they also are not capable of changing themselves. A rooster's going to be a rooster, and a rooster's always going to be a rooster. And I think that another example of this are, you could also apply to some of the things that are not overtly said on the record. Like, for example, the Me Too movement, some of the men who refused to take some of those lessons to heart, like some of the people who just doubled down on their behavior. Like anyone who just refuses to hear evidence to the contrary of their belief systems is kind of what a rooster was for me. And a lot of like the big figures for me were roosters. But then eventually, if the world demands change enough, well, then the world will force you to change. And so that song, the words are at the beginning, it's like, the roosters have begun to piss the world off, and so everything they knew began to change, and then basically they just are literally manipulated into something else in the context of the song. And they no longer exist as roosters. Now they're something else. So that is my hope. I don't know that will be the case with Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin. I hope it is. I hope that they change. I hope that the world forces them to change. But, so that's what that symbol meant. How close was I to what you were thinking about?
I think I was fairly far off. But following up on what you said, are the roosters... Is the song at all from the rooster's perspective? Or like vaguely the perspective of a rooster?
It is, and this is one of the few cases where, and I try not to do this very often. I try not to use my own perspective very often. No. What I mean is just that, like, when I'm writing songs, I try not to make the I be me. Personally, I always try to have the I or the me be some character or some larger thing. But in this case, like the once it becomes from the narrator's perspective, some of that is me, and some of that is feeling like I myself was a rooster, and like I was kind of all right. So first verse is not from the rooster's perspective, but then, parking lot, I drank old bitter coffee. There was this moment where I was sitting in my car and I was listening to the news, and I had stayed up all night and I just went for a drive. I was watching the sun come up in some parking lot, and I was just thinking about all the bad decisions that I've made or all the regrets that I had. And I'm listening to the news, and the news is it's all this horrible, just this onslaught of bad news that is constant if you listen to the news, right? And I'm just thinking about, like, just beating myself up over all the mistakes that I've made, and starting to feel like seeing myself in some of the characters in the news that I'm hearing. I'm just seeing myself in all these places. Sometimes when you're up for a really long time and you haven't slept, you can just really just get lost in your own mind.
Yeah.
Just hate yourself, and that's kind of where I was at for that. So the answer is that yes, it was kind of in a way it's from a rooster's perspective, which was for a moment that song was me.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the crux of what I was getting to, as I was trying to figure out who's if it exists, who specifically is speaking with the sort of the line that becomes the crux of the song. Who am I to build a new life? Who am I to build a home?
Yeah, and that was, like I say, I try not to do that too often, but yeah, that was me. Like, that's me asking myself to, I mean, when you start adding up all of the mistakes that you've made in your life and the mistakes that you like are continuing to make. And, maybe you're trying to grow, and I'm trying to learn, I'm trying to get better. But then when you start adding all these things up, and then you weigh it against the good things that you have in your life, you start saying, like, who am I to have all these good things when my neighbor over there, she's working her fucking ass off, working 3 jobs, trying to support her 4 kids, and, why can't she get what I have? And why is it that, like, how do I deserve this? I don't, so,
okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm reading a question if I'm deciding if I want to ask or not.
Yeah. No. It's fine. Yeah. So I don't know. Like, it's hard to like kind of see, all of these political international events through a personal perspective. But yeah, that was why I wanted to maybe call it that. I was like, I'm seeing all these things through my own eyes, and then I see all these horrific figures, and then I see myself in a lot of these horrific figures. Like, by no means am I Donald Trump or Muammar Gaddafi or anything like that. But there's plenty of bad shit that I got inside of me. There's plenty of bad shit in everyone's past and everyone's heart, and it's just, but I think part of it is, well, how do you get over that? And it's like you acknowledge that and you try to grow from it.
I think I'm going to skip the next question I have because it's very involved, and it involves a lot of my own thoughts about the last track, and I'd rather leave it up to people to have their own thoughts about it.
Okay. Yeah.
So
I like that. Yeah, leave it a little open-ended so that.
I mean, if I have so many different thoughts wrapped up in the close of the album, then I'm hoping a lot of other people will too, and I don't want to impart too much on the close of it, which I think is very big and a very good summation of the overarching ideas of it.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, hopefully is open-ended and.
All right.
Where now kind of thing.
Yeah. My next question is very much a question for me.
Okay.
Being the fan of physical media that I am, obsessant some might say, and with your interesting history of physical releases, of course, through like Useless State Records.
Yeah.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask about this phrase I saw in the pre-order description you have up for the CD. Which is with special album cover. Are you planning some alternate artwork?
Yes,
I am.
That
the one that I saw up on Hair Pond with like the faces and everything?
Yeah. So
sweet.
I am working on that stuff. I've created at least one just CD version of it, and I wish that vinyl was more affordable, because I'm doing everything out of my own pocket, and I'm a teacher. I don't make a lot of money, so I can't always afford to make a bunch of things, and so I actually had to start with a CD of it and just hope that I could raise some funds and get enough scratch together to make a vinyl of it. But there's at least going to be 2 different album covers for it, and there will be like some slight differences between the albums themselves, but the one that you're referring to is actually artwork that Keith Rawson made for this. And Keith Rawson is he's an author and he's an artist, and he's been in the punk world for a good while. A lot of people know his zine Avow is the name of a zine that he's done since the early 90s or mid 90s. And anyway, Keith, he's done a lot of like punk art over the years, and he's actually helped us with some Taxpayer's releases, and I consider him a friend. And him and I actually met through teaching, believe it or not, back when I lived in Portland. I taught at an after-school arts program where we would teach kids in elementary just the different arts, and so he also worked for that. That's how I met him, probably in maybe like 2009 or 2008 maybe. I can't remember exactly the year, but he was an entity that I knew of already because I was reading his zine, Avow, and I was like, oh, I love this dude's stuff. And he's a remarkable visual artist. He's a painter, and he had a couple of books published recently, one that's called The Mercy of the Tide, one that's called Smoke City, and just one of my favorite writers. But also just an amazing artist, amazing painter.
Yeah, it's a really striking image.
Isn't it? Yeah, and so I sent him the tracks, and I was like, I know that he had just adopted some kids recently with his partner, and and it's just been crazy at their house having quarantine with these like newly adopted kids, and I asked him, I was like, hey, are you still doing art? Like, would you be into this? Like, no worries if you don't have the time right now, but he was like, yeah, I can. Let's do it. And so he listened to the songs, and that was the art that he had put together for some of that. And then when I was originally just going to have that be the artwork for it, but then I asked him, would it be all right with you if I did a few different alternate album covers to kind of fit different songs? Because I started playing around with some of the videos that I made with the Anxiety Cat songs, and I started thinking that it might be neat to create some symmetry between the songs and the videos themselves. And so he was like, yeah, of course, like you commission this, you do what you want with it, or you don't even have to use it, use it however you want. And so, yeah, ever since then I've been kind of trying to fit different pieces together like a puzzle and kind of create a visual puzzle to go along with the record.
Nice.
Yeah. So the answer is yes. I only have one of the CDs made right now because, again, money is an issue. But my hope is to, if I can raise enough scratch for it, is to get a couple of different versions of the album art.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Big general blanket question: is there anything you want listeners to know about going into the end of reality as we know it? Could be absolutely nothing. Just want to give you an opportunity.
The one thing I would say in terms of the habits of listenership in 2020 is that not a lot of people always listen to records from front to back. And I think it's an important record to listen to front to back, because it was created with, the order being a really important aspect of it. And so you can definitely listen to songs out of context, and that's fine. But the larger story itself, I think, can only be told in a certain way. And so, yeah, that would be just one thing. And I think another thing is that, and I feel terrible, Luke, that I didn't send you the lyrics to go along with this. But yeah, words, I would love for the words to be a part of it, And then in addition to that, once those videos come out, I do think that they're an important component to helping understand, kind of like what I was telling you about the end of growth, and that the video kind of provides some of the information that you need to make sense of that song. Because when you listen to it just by itself, it's a kind of a head scratcher. You're like, what is going on with that Arabic right there? If I don't speak Arabic, what is happening? And so I think that the video is an important thing to listen to. But yeah, larger thing is that, thank you to anybody that gives it, a half hour of their time to have a listen to it. And I just appreciating time that people can spend on it, because I know that time is at a premium for most people, and it can be hard to carve out some time to listen to something that is as abrasive as that record can be at times. Not completely abrasive, but a lot of it's a bit abrasive. And keep an open mind, challenge yourself, challenge your beliefs, because that's what the whole project has been for me, is a method for challenging my own beliefs and understanding of the world.
And one thing, is the visual component coming out also on the 29th? Then, regardless of when it's coming out, where is that side of things gonna be accessible?
Those will be accessible on YouTube. I'm gonna put it all on Rob Taxpayer's YouTube channel, I guess. That's a great question. That's one of the reasons I asked Alec for some help with this. Is I was like, I don't really know
where to host it. Yeah.
How do I release this? Like what do I do? And I've always done a terrible job with that, which is why a lot of this stuff just kind of ends up floating around in the ether for a while because I didn't really think that stuff through. But yeah, it's going to be on hairpond.org. Anything that I do is going to be on hairpond.org. I'm glad that I finally got that site up and running because I've been wanting a place to stick stuff for a while. Yeah, thanks. My friend Nicole made that website. She basically reached out to me and she was like, hey, you're trying to make this website. That's what I do. And she's one of my best friends. And I was like, oh, you sure? It's a lot of time. Are you sure you have that kind of – she's got a new baby, and she set aside some time to help me figure that out. And, yeah, so she did a great job with that. Now I have a place to put videos and things like that. So it's all going to be on hairpond.org. It'll also be on YouTube. Like the main place that I'm going to upload it to will be through YouTube. And I guess the place that I've been uploading stuff is robtaxpayer1@gmail. I don't know. That's where I upload it to, I guess. I don't know. Do you have a YouTube channel, Luke? How do you do this kind of thing?
Do I? I definitely don't, man.
Yeah.
I mean that's probably one of the most frequent not even critiques, just like pieces of advice people give me or things that I'm asked for. One was, do something with Spotify. Can you please give us a playlist? Spotify was something I didn't even have. And
me neither.
I finally made one, but because
I did just now too. Yeah, just now I did.
I don't like the listening process of it, but I'm also once again trying to play both sides and not be a complete pretentious asshole. I mean, not everyone has either the financial ability or the time required to acquire all of the stuff I have, and there's a lot of stuff that's just like it's hard to find a physical copy of. Wouldn't it be great if I could access it at all? Because at the end of the day, I love the physical release, but the music's the important part. So
sure.
Luckily, I haven't done really anything at all myself, but I had someone that followed my project had been just making a giant, it's dozens of hours long playlist of just, if I brought up an album, I brought up a song, he threw it on a playlist.
Oh, cool.
And then I just had, I just had several weeks ago, I had this one woman, Brooke, make a Pennsylvania focused one, because she's just like this great champion of Pennsylvania folk punk fandom. I was like, here, curate this. I will share it through my page, and just show off all your friends, basically.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, the thing is, Spotify, everybody uses it. I did not create anything on Spotify until did I? Or was that SoundCloud? Maybe I haven't even created a Spotify. I kind of forget which is which, but neither of those things that I have before the Anxiety Cat thing. And you know what the reason is? Is because it always pissed me off that I had to sign up for an account to listen to stuff on those things. I was always like, someone would like link to something and I would click it, and it would take me to like, you have to register for an account to listen. I was like, fuck you. No, you can't force me to sign up for SoundCloud, buddy. And so I was a holdout on it for so long, and then eventually, you realize, well, this is what people consume music through, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so finally I did it. I was an early, more easily adopted YouTube just because there was no requirement of me to fill out anything to do it, I could just have a Gmail account and then I could upload stuff. And that's how I listen to records, by the way. If I want to listen to an old record by Dizzy Gillespie, I type in the name of the record, YouTube, and then I listen to the album on YouTube.
Yeah. That's a great place to find full albums.
Yeah, definitely.
The actual answer to that giant ass tangent I just threw at you was that the other thing people tell me to do is like, you should do videos. And like, I'll have people ask me why I like hide my face and stuff. I'm like, well, one, that shows me I haven't followed my project long enough. Scroll back, my face is on there. I did a post where I'm literally just standing with several people. But also the fact that like, I'm not hiding. It's just I'm so much not the focus. I'm just I'm the vessel that is writing about all this stuff, and I make sure everything's in the first person and everything. But like,
I think that's a cool part of it, though, is that it's not like it's not a vanity project for you. It's
a vanity project
truly
for the physical release.
Yeah.
That's why
I mean,
put
it's
it on Instagram.
Yeah, no, you're a cataloger, you're a researcher, and that kind of stuff. And so you're not trying to have a stage necessarily, which is a very admirable thing in a world that everybody demands to be the center of fucking attention all the time. And I think that's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I'm okay with how it's running. Video's not very much my thing. Brandon wants me to come down to Texas, and he wants to start like a video podcast, like bi-monthly or something.
Yeah, you told me about it. Yeah. I think that's a cool idea.
He wants to do an episode where like he flies me in, and I critique his record collection or something silly like that.
That'd be funny.
Yeah, sure, fine. I'm not, I'm very much not hiding anyone that goes to a show. I'll introduce myself and.
Yeah.
All right.
Man. Yeah.
Oh, go on.
Yeah, go on. No. You go on. You were about to ask something.
Well, I was about to change to a different thing. So if you got something to say on this, go for it.
Oh no, I'm just about to say I think that it is phenomenal the way you're doing it. So don't change a thing. Don't let anyone pressure you into doing something you don't want to. So keep up what you're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, now I wrote in a decompression question because I always feel like I'm interrogating people because I get very detail oriented when I'm like, all right, here's your album. I've written down several pages of notes about it. Tell me about it. I have just a general decompression question. Obviously there's a lot of people that are, doing their part to minimize all this, and which means they are much more homebound than they often are. So for the sake of those people and for myself, because I love recommendations, recommend the world a record, an entree or dish, and an activity. I was also going to say a book, but you already gave me a great recommendation with The Sandman. Doesn't have to be the best record, just has to be a record. It doesn't have to be the best of anything, just something.
Okay. Let me think. Something that would be a good record recommendation for right now. I think I'm going to try to not recommend something that's punk or within that world.
Absolutely.
I'm gonna recommend Thelonious Monk's "Alone in San Francisco" record. And I've listened to that just 1,000 times, and I think that's just a really nice way to spend some time. So before classes start at the community college that I'm at, I always try to put on some music in the background to take some of the stress off of coming into a classroom. A lot of people come into a classroom with anxiety, and so I always try to put on some classical music or some jazz. And that record I put on a lot because it's good background music for one, but it's also, if you want to listen to it, it's very, very challenging at the same time. It's one of the few records that can be both challenging and background music at the same time. It can kind of be what you need it to be. And the reason that I want to choose a Thelonious Monk solo album instead of some of his work with some other musicians is because so many of his records, you don't actually get to hear the piano really come through in the way that, because this was a person that there is no pianist like Thelonious Monk. Nobody has ever been able to play like him before or after. Nobody even comes close. Some people try to mimic him, but nobody can do what he did, which was like kind of create these weird little atonal melodies that in any other pianist's hands would sound unlistenable. But they're so melodic, and they're so like challenging and thought-provoking at the same time. And I've also been working my way through a Thelonious Monk biography recently, and so it's also on my mind.
Is it the autobiography?
Yeah, well, it's not an autobiography. I'm trying to think of the name of it. I'm not
I have the autobiography.
It's a big, thick one, and it's geez, I don't have it in front of me. I feel like maybe it's just called Monk. Is the the name of it. I'll tell you what. I'll text you the name of it when I head back into the house, because I'm not in the house right now where the book's at. But yeah, he tells this story at the beginning of it to the person who wrote it, and the story he tells is, he was like, everybody said when I was playing that I couldn't, read music, and it was clear that there was just this big bumbling elephant that was just banging away on the piano with his giant elephant hands. And he tells this story about his daughter. Actually, he doesn't tell the story now that I think about it. I think it's his niece telling this story. And she was like, I went into Uncle Thelonious' house, and he had a piano, and she was kind of sassing him. She was a little girl at the time, and she was saying, you can't even read music. And he was like, nuh-uh. And so he opens up like a Bach piece, and he opens it up, and he plays it like 6 times the regular speed that it should, and he reads it just really fast, and he plays this very complex Bach piece on the piano, and she stops him and she goes, but you didn't play it allegro like it said. I thought that was so funny, because he's just like, I can't win with these people, including my niece. But it was like just this misunderstood genius, who just to this day, just like, if I had, Desert Island discs, that would be one of my Desert Island discs. One of the Solo Monk records, for sure.
High praise.
Yeah. And as far as a dish,
yeah,
I'm gonna go
try or make.
with. Sorry, what's that?
Yeah, something to try or make, or
Something to try or make. Well, Bob's potato surprise is no, I won't recommend my greasy potatoes. How about I guess the best winter and spring and like chilly weather going into warm weather food for me is a dark roux gumbo that is chicken and sausage, and my favorite that you can actually buy if you're not the kind of person that wants to spend 3 days making a gumbo like they recommend, you don't want to sit in front of a simmering pot for 3 days, and you want to just buy some. The only like legit gumbo I think you can buy online is through Chef John Folse, Folse, and he makes a great dark roux chicken and sausage gumbo. And he also makes, for the vegans out there, there's a version of it that you can get that's vegan that has a green roux. It's like called green gumbo, and it's actually pretty darn good for that kind of thing. Like it can be hard to recreate that the effect of just the heartiness and like the thickness of it without all the nasty parts. But he does a pretty good job. John Folse does a good job with it. And you can buy that stuff frozen. I recommended this to my buddy Eric up in Minneapolis because he was like, hey, Rob, where can I get, can I buy some gumbo from a place online? He's like, you live in New Orleans. Is there a place where you could just send it to me? And I was like, I don't know if I could get away with sending you frozen gumbo in the mail. I feel like that's probably going to melt and I'm going to get in a bunch of trouble. But I recommended that to him, and he got a thing of that. And it's a little pricey. You got to be willing to spend a little money on it, but it's worth it. It's just a hell of a hearty meal.
All right.
Yeah. That's what I'll go for.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you have an activity?
Oh, an activity?
The Vegas
like,
one, an activity.
Just like any activity to try.
Absolutely. Something to try.
Okay, let me think.
All this may go in, may not. I like the idea of being able to decompress after this.
Yeah, I like that. All right, so okay. There's this game that my friend Stevie and I, her and me, played in. We were traveling around in Europe. This was a while ago, and we made this game out of. We called it Where's Waldo, but it's how it works is you pick a person out of a crowd, and what you do is you follow them from a distance. And so it has to be in a walking area, like a walking city. We did this in Venice. We went, we looked up for some cheap flights from where we're at, where we're like, where can we go that we can afford to go? And it was like a cheap flight to there from where we were at. So we went over there. We had no plans. And we made up this game where what you do is you pick a person out of the crowd, you follow them from a distance like you're a spy, and you have to make up a game. Not make up a game. You have to make up a backstory, like a biography of that person. You have to give them a name. You have to give them a backstory. You have to give them a reason that they're where they are. And it has to be a single solitary person. It can't be like a group of people. And you have to just follow them for as long as you can without them realizing it. And it's a really fun game because you feel like a spy, and then eventually, and by the way, I don't know if I would do this anymore. We did this game,
where would you even find a crowd of people right now?
I know. I was just going to say, maybe this is a bad game for right now, but, where are you going to find a crowd of people? But also, now that I think about it, maybe this is a creepy game, and we didn't realize it at the time. So don't do it if you're trying to like scare someone, and I guess men don't go following around, I don't know, like just don't be a creep about it, but if you can do it respectfully from a distance, it can be a really fun game. Like we had this guy that we picked out of the crowd he was wearing a striped shirt, and that's why we called it Where's Waldo? And we followed him all day long, just from like place to place, and he was just some tourist who was walking around Venice, and we gave him a whole backstory and everything. And how it ended was he eventually realized we were following him about 6 hours into the day.
Oh my God.
And like he realized we were following him, and so he tried to get away from us, and he kind of started playing the game with us, and he would like smile and he would wave, and he would try to like out maneuver us, and eventually it ended with him getting on a boat and then staring right at us with a big smile and waving at us like and we waved at him. It was a really funny moment.
That's such a fulfilling end to the game, though.
It really was. It was great. I never got to meet him. I really had hoped that I would get to meet him, but
have like a debriefing.
Yeah, just like, look, we're not being weird. Well, we were being weirdos, but we mean no harm to you. Yeah, so that's my activity that I'll recommend.
All right. Where's Waldo?
Yeah.
That's
do so at your own risk. Yeah.
That's all I got.
Yeah. Cool. Well, this has been fun. We talked for 2 hours, Luke. That's a long time. It's late your time, isn't it?